March 14th, 1969. Western Quảng Trị province, tight against the Laotian border. The night rain had stopped, but the air still carried it. Warm wetness, the smell of leaf rot and JP4, a mist that clung to sandbags and turned the ridgelines into bruised silhouettes. Dawn did not brighten, it merely thinned the dark. Chief Warrant Officer Joel Rourke climbed into his UH-1H Huey as if he were stepping into a confession. Fire Support Base Granite sat on a scar of red dirt, hacked out of jungle, an artillery island surrounded by green that could swallow sound and men. Around it, the war pulsed in layers. Along the valleys and the hidden trails, the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, moved heavy and disciplined, feeding the Ho Chi Minh Trail like a bloodstream. In the villages and folds of terrain closer to the coast, Viet Cong, VC guerrillas, watched roads and listened for rotor blades. Above all of it, usually farther north, there was the other war, jets, radar and missiles, a clean geometry that had no place in a Huey's slow, exposed sky. Rourke's aircraft, call sign Ragman Two-Four, was a slick with two door-mounted M60s, belts of 7.62 fed from green cans that clanked when the airframe shivered. The right gun belonged to Specialist 4th Class Eddie Keenan, a door gunner from Ohio, with forearms like wire and a quiet way of checking his weapon as if it were the only honest thing in the valley. Behind the pilots, Sergeant Harlow, crew chief, leaned into straps and metal, listening to the Huey's turbine spool as though it could confess what the day would cost. They lifted at 0612 with 3 other helicopters in a staggered trail. Slicks to carry men and cargo, a gunship escort to carve tree lines if they needed room to breathe. The plan was ordinary: insert and resupply near the Azore corridor, then back to Granite before the morning heat turned the valleys into a steaming throat. Ordinary plans were what you made in Vietnam, because the alternatives sounded like superstition. The first hint that the morning had changed came as clipped voices bleeding into their radios. Vietnamese, urgent, not on their net, sliding into the UHF band with the brittle certainty of an alarm. Then Granite Control cut in. Calm gone. Ragman flight, be advised. Unknown fast movers reported southbound, low altitude near the fence line. Possible MiG activity. Keep your heads on a swivel. MiGs were not supposed to be here. Hueys were not built for the kind of sky where MiGs lived. A Huey was slow and honest, a machine that could lift pain out of a clearing and then hang in the air long enough to die for it. A MiG-17 was something else, speed and cannon fire and the confidence of altitude. Rourke pushed his flight under the cloud base, trying to disappear into the low grey. The jungle slid beneath them, endless and close, treetops bowing under rotor wash. Razor 11, their escort, climbed higher for cover, rockets and miniguns ready for ground threats that suddenly felt irrelevant. At 0627, the first MiG punched through the mist like a blade. It came from the north, a grey wedge with swept wings, low enough that Keenan saw the flash of canopy glass and the pale ring of its intake. Then a second shape cut through the cloud base, and a third, stacking into the valley like predators testing a pen. Rourke's formation scattered instinctively, each pilot trying to be the least easy target. The first MiG made a pass that was more threat than kill. Its cannon spat a short burst, tracers ripping the air behind Ragman 2-3. The sound was not like rifle fire, it was tearing cloth at the scale of metal. Keenan's hands tightened around the M60's spade grips. The gun felt suddenly small. He had fired at muzzle flashes in tree lines, at boats on rivers, at figures running in elephant grass. A jet was a different kind of problem. It crossed the sky faster than the mind wanted to accept, but the MiG did not stay high. It came back around and came lower, rolling into a head-on line that would rake Ragman Two-Four's belly. Voss, Rourke's co-pilot, shouted, "Brake, brake!" Rourke jinked hard, the Huey shuddering as the rotor disc bit at wet air. Instruments flared warnings, torque, rotor, RPM, like the aircraft was protesting being asked to dance at the edge of its own limits. The MiG kept coming anyway, using the low cloud and the valley walls to stay inside their reaction time. In that narrowing slice of time, Keenan stopped trying to be reasonable. He leaned out into the open door until the harness straps cut into his shoulders, wind punching his helmet. He did not aim at where the MiG was. He aimed at where it had to be. He squeezed the trigger. The M60 bucked with its familiar rhythm, 600 rounds a minute, a steady cough under the turbine whine. Brass casings whipped out and vanished into the green. Tracers stitched an arc through wet air. For a heartbeat it looked like nothing but bright lines thrown in panic. Then the MiG twitched. A puff of smoke bloomed near the nose. The jet yawed violently, wingtip dipping, as if an invisible fist had struck it. It flashed past the Huey's rotor disc by a distance so small, Rourke felt it as a cold pressure behind his eyes. The MiG did not explode in the air. It simply lost its argument with physics and slammed into the hillside beyond, shearing through trees before erupting into a dirty orange bloom that the jungle tried to smother. Over the radio, Razor 11's pilot sounded like he didn't trust his own senses. "Ragman, did you just hit that thing?" Keenan didn't answer. His mouth was open. His hands were locked on the grips. He smelled cordite and rain and burning fuel. The remaining two MiGs did not break away. They climbed just enough to stay under the cloud base, then split like hunting dogs. One slid toward the east, angling for Granite, where the artillery flashes marked a target as clearly as a flare. The other stayed with Ragman flight, circling wide and then tightening, searching for the slowest helicopter, the one that would panic and climb into the open. Rourke kept Ragman Two-Four low, the Huey's belly almost brushing the canopy. He could feel the heat building in the turbine, could hear the rotor blades bite and complain when he threw the aircraft into another shallow break. The gunship escort called out positions. "Fast movers, 9 o'clock high," now diving, and each call felt like a countdown. Keenan forced himself to reload, hands moving by habit. The belt was damp and cold. The receiver cover slammed shut with a finality that made his throat tighten. He had fired at a jet and it had fallen, and that should have been impossible. The war had just shown him that impossible things could happen, which meant the impossible could happen the other way too. Granite control came back over the net, breathless. "Ragman, Granite, one fast mover is inbound the base. Repeat, inbound. We are taking fire." In the cockpit, Rourke and Voss exchanged a look that needed no words. If the jets reached Granite's fuel and ammunition, the base would become a furnace. If Ragman flight ran, the men on the ground would take the full weight of the attack alone. Rourke rolled the Huey into a turn toward the smoke. Two MiGs remained, and the valley was no longer pretending it belonged to helicopters. The valley tightened like a fist. Ragman flight dropped to treetop level, using terrain the way a swimmer uses rocks in a current, anything to break the line of sight. Rotor wash tore leaves into the air. The Huey's skids skimmed above bamboo and broken limestone, the jungle so close it felt like it was trying to grab them. The second MiG rolled in from the left, belly flashing through the grey. Its cannons fired in short bursts, tracers thicker than the M60's, red-hot nails thrown at impossible speed. Rounds snapped through treetops and tore bark into pale splinters. Rourke shoved the cyclic forward and dumped altitude into a shallow ravine, forcing the jet to overshoot or crash. It overshot, then climbed hard, banking back into the cloud base to turn for another strike. Up and ahead, the third MiG chose a different target. It dropped toward Fire Support Base Granite itself, drawn by artillery flashes and the soft geometry of a base that couldn't move. Granite's perimeter guns tracked it late, as if their muscles hadn't learned the shape of a jet at that altitude. The MiG fired into the base, kicking up geysers of dirt and sandbag dust. A fuel drum erupted. Smoke rolled low across the gun pits. Granite Control's voice cut through the net, stripped bare. "All aircraft, be advised, Granite taking air attack, requesting fast mover cover, any available." There was no fast mover cover in that slice of sky. There was only Razor 11, a gunship built to punish tree lines, and a handful of Hueys that suddenly felt like prey. Rourke made his decision without drama. He turned back toward the base. Ragman Two-Four inbound granite. We can't leave them. Voss stared at him. You want to run into it? We're already in it, Rourke said, and pushed power. Granite filled the windshield, a muddy oval of bunkers, artillery pits and smoke, surrounded by jungle like a wound. The MiG that had strafed it was pulling up for another pass, turning tight and low. That low turn bled its speed. That low turn put it inside an envelope where even a helicopter could threaten it, if the timing was perfect and the shooter didn't flinch. Keenan leaned out, harness straps biting. He had no sight beyond the crude ring, no stabilization beyond his own body braced against vibration. He waited for the jet to level for its run. When it did, he fired a long burst, long enough that the M60's barrel smoked, long enough that the links snapped away in a metallic rain. He walked the tracers ahead of the canopy line, then held them there, forcing the MiG to fly through his stream. The jet jerked. Sparks flashed near the cockpit. Its nose dipped as if the pilot had let go. It clipped the top of the berm, cartwheeled into the tree line beyond, and detonated in a dirty orange bloom that threw heat across the base. Voss breathed out, like he'd been holding his lungs since dawn. That's two! There was no time to feel it. The remaining MiG was already turning back, and this time it came straight for Ragman Two-Four, head-on, confident in its cannon and speed. Rourke dropped collective and dove for the base, trying to force an overshoot. The MiG's cannons flashed, the air around the Huey tore. A line of rounds walked across the tail boom, metal screamed, the helicopter lurched. Warning lights bloomed on the panel. Harlow shouted from the cabin, voice sharp with panic. "Tail rotor hit! We're losing it!" The Huey began to yaw right. At first it was manageable, then it accelerated into a spin that smeared jungle, base and sky into a rotating wheel. Rourke fought the pedals, sweat beading under his helmet, but the tail no longer listened. The MiG flashed past and climbed away, as if it had already decided the helicopter would finish itself. Inside the cabin, Keenan's ammunition belt jumped and snagged as centrifugal force yanked it. He tore it free with numb fingers and locked back onto the grips. The spin made his stomach rise. The wind changed direction every half-second, slapping him, then pulling him, then slapping again. Hydraulic fluid and burned insulation crept into the cockpit smell like a verdict. Granite's 50s and M60s fired up at the jet, tracers reaching, but their arcs fell short. The MiG stayed just outside their effective envelope, rolling in only when it wanted to end this. Rourke tasted copper in his mouth and understood the math. In a spinning helicopter there was no running. There was only timing. He called over his shoulder, voice calm because panic was contagious. "Keene, listen. When I say now, you'll have one window. Use the spin. Don't fight it. Ride it." Keenan didn't answer, but his hands tightened until his knuckles whitened. The MiG descended again out of the cloud base, shallow dive, closing fast. It had to slow in the dive to keep the Huey in sight, to keep its guns from flashing past the target. For a heartbeat, it lived in the same close, ugly airspace as the helicopter. Rourke steadied the nose as best he could, with collective and cyclic, letting the yaw turn the cabin like a crude turret. He watched the MiG grow in the windscreen, saw the wings flick as it corrected. He waited until it was close enough that the jet's canopy was more than a glint, until Keenan could see the dark shape of a pilot inside. Then he said, "Now." Keenan squeezed the trigger at the exact moment the Huey's rotation swept his M60 through the jet's flight path. The M60 bucked. Tracers reached out and struck low at first, sparks skipping off the underside. He held the trigger and corrected with his body as the spin carried the barrel upward. A beat later, the MiG's intake flared orange, an ugly tongue inside the mouth of the aircraft. Smoke burst from the fuselage. The jet wobbled, rolled hard, and climbed like it was trying to escape its own failure. It vanished into the grey, trailing smoke, and somewhere beyond the ridge, a distant impact thudded through the rain. Granite's guns fell silent, one by one. The sky emptied. Rourke's Huey was still spinning and still damaged. He forced it down into the only open patch of earth near the base, lowering collective and committing before the rotation could tear the aircraft apart. The skids hit hard, bounced once, then slammed down again. The rotor blades flexed and clawed at wet air. When it settled, the turbine still screaming, Keenan sat in his harness with his chest heaving, hands locked to the grips as if letting go might invite the MiGs back. Men from Granite ran toward them through mud and smoke, eyes wide. No one cheered. In that war, survival didn't sound like celebration. It sounded like breathing. By mid-morning, the rain returned with intent, turning Granite's churned earth into a slick paste that clung to boots and soaked into fatigues until everyone wore the same dark stain. Medics pulled the Ragman crew from the Huey as if extracting them from a wrecked ship. Harlow's hands shook when he tried to light a cigarette. Ross sat on an ammo crate and stared at nothing, lips moving in silent replay. Keenan, still in his helmet, stared at his M60 as if it were a stranger that had spoken in his voice. The base commander, a captain with eyes like worn glass, walked up and looked at the torn tail boom, the ragged holes punched by 23mm rounds. He touched the metal, fingers coming away greasy with hydraulic fluid. "If they'd held you one more pass," he said quietly, "I'd be writing letters." Rourke climbed down last. His flight suit was wet through, his hands stained with grime from the controls. He looked older than he had at dawn. His jaw worked once, like he was chewing words he didn't want to say. "We need to report it," he said. "Proper." Reporting was not a simple act. It meant radios, forms, after-action statements, and then the long chain of command that could turn a moment into a record or into a rumor. It meant having to explain how a door gunner with a 7.62 machine gun had shot down 3 MiGs, an outcome that, on paper, bordered on impossible, but Granite had witnesses. Men on the perimeter had watched the first jet burn into the hillside. Gunners had seen the second impact beyond the berm. Artillery crews had felt the blast. A forward observer had tracked the third MiG on binoculars until it disappeared, trailing smoke. Razor 11's pilot, orbiting higher, had called the events on the radio in real time, voice recordings spooled onto tape back at Granite's operations bunker. Within an hour, an intelligence team arrived by helicopter. Sweaty men with cameras, maps, and the clipped urgency of those who knew they were about to step into something that would echo beyond one valley. They took photographs of the Huey's damage, measured holes, collected shattered link fragments from Keenan's ammunition belt. They recorded statements. The questions were the same, asked in different ways. How close were the jets? How many rounds did he fire? Where did he aim? Was there any chance the ground guns had done it first? Keenan answered as best he could. He didn't embellish, because there was nothing to embellish. "They came low," he said, voice flat. "I shot where they had to be." Rourke described the spin, the decision to use the Huey's yaw as a crude aiming device. The intelligence officer raised an eyebrow. "You turned your aircraft into a rotating gun mount." Rourke didn't look proud. It was already rotating. "I just stopped pretending I could outrun it." The claim moved up the chain like a spark in dry grass. Within 24 hours, it reached Da Nang. Within 48, it was whispered at 7th Air Force briefings, where men in crisp shirts stared at maps and tried to reconcile it with everything they understood about jets and helicopters. Some believed it instantly, not because it made sense, but because Vietnam had a way of producing moments that made sense only to the people who survived them. Others dismissed it as a confusion of events. Ground fire, pilot error, coincidence wrapped in adrenaline. Then came the problem of proof. The jungle did not give up wreckage easily. The first MiG had crashed into a hillside thick with bamboo and vines. The second had cartwheeled into tree line beyond Granite's berm, leaving a crater that steamed in the rain. The third, if it had gone down, had disappeared somewhere beyond the ridgeline, in contested terrain where patrols were already taking fire from NVA scouts. A recovery team went out anyway, escorted by infantry. They moved through mud that sucked at their boots, through leeches, through the heavy quiet that always meant someone was watching. They found the first crash site by smell before they saw it. Burned aviation fuel, scorched leaves, the metallic stink of hot steel that the rain could not wash away. The MiGs fuselage lay torn open like an animal, engine twisted, canopy shattered. Nearby, half buried in mud, they found 7.62 impact marks, small, clean punctures where metal had been persuaded, at close range, to fail. The second site was closer, easier. Fragments of wing lay scattered in the brush. A piece of the intake ring was lodged in a tree. A torn section of canopy glass glittered like ice. Again, the wreckage showed penetrations consistent with small arms fire clustered near the forward fuselage. The third was the nightmare. Patrols pushed over the ridge and met fire almost immediately. The NVA were there in strength, not in a full battalion movement, but in enough numbers and enough discipline to make every step forward expensive. The Americans and their ARVN counterparts traded shots in dripping foliage, rounds snapping through leaves, mortar rounds thumped in from somewhere unseen, bursting in wet concussions. A radio operator shouted grids, voice shaking. The team had to withdraw, dragging one wounded man through mud, leaving the question of the third crash hanging in the jungle like smoke. Back at Granite, the claim remained 2 confirmed wreck sites and 1 likely. 2 was still extraordinary. 3 was the kind of number that made people uncomfortable. The discomfort deepened when word spread to the other side. Intercepts later suggested NVA air defense and fighter units had logged an engagement near the border that morning. They had reported losses. They had also reported helicopter fire, a detail that made their own officers angry because it implied their pilots had died in a way that sounded humiliating. In Hanoi, where the war was narrated as a story of discipline and inevitability, the idea of a MiG falling to a door gunner's machine gun did not fit the script. Within days, Granite's perimeter came under renewed pressure. NVA mortars found the base at night, walking rounds across the wire, forcing men into bunkers where the air smelled like sweat and fear and damp sandbags. Viet Cong patrols probed the nearby villages, hunting for informants, trying to learn which helicopter unit had been in the air that morning. The jungle retaliated in its own quiet way, as if it disliked the story that had been written into it. For Ragman Two-Four's crew, the war went back to its normal rhythm: lifts, inserts, medevacs, the constant thrum of turbine engines, and the constant possibility of a sudden, ugly end. But something had shifted. Every time Keenan heard a distant aircraft, even a friendly one, his stomach tightened. Every time Rourke saw the cloud base settle low over the hills, he remembered a grey wedge appearing out of it. In the weeks that followed, an investigation team from higher headquarters arrived. They brought better cameras, more questions, and a skepticism that wore a polite face. They interviewed the base gunners. They listened to radio tapes. They compared the wreckage photographs to known MiG-17 structural points. They calculated the ballistic arc of a 7.62 round fired from a vibrating helicopter platform at a jet traveling several hundred knots, and they shook their heads in disbelief. Yet the evidence refused to disappear. The puncture patterns were there, the witness statements aligned. Razor 11's gun camera footage, grainy, shaking, limited, caught a MiG silhouette pitching and then vanishing behind a ridge with smoke trailing. It was not definitive, but it was enough to haunt the skeptics. The conclusion they wrote was careful. It did not use language like shot down with certainty. It used phrases like probable contributing factor, confirmed crash sites, likely engagement result. The army, after all, had a way of turning miracles into paperwork. But the story spread anyway because men needed stories like that. In a war where so much felt out of control, the idea that a door gunner could look at a jet and refuse to be prey, it meant something. At night, in bunkers lit by red flashlights, soldiers spoke the name Keenan had now earned. They called him 3 MiG, not as a joke, but as a shorthand for a moment when the war's logic broke. They didn't say it loudly. Superstition lived in those valleys. You didn't invite the jungle to prove you wrong. Keenan himself didn't like the nickname. He wrote letters home that described the rain and the heat and the boredom, and never once mentioned MiGs. When his mother asked in a reply if he was safe, he wrote back, "As safe as anyone here can be." It was the only honest answer. Rourke filed his report, flew his missions, and at night lay on his cot, listening to distant artillery and the soft hiss of rain on tin. He knew the war would not remember him the way it remembered fighter aces. He knew the army would likely bury the event under cautious phrasing, but he also knew what he'd seen. 3 jets in a valley, and 1 door gunner refusing to die on schedule. The air war over Vietnam was often portrayed as clean lines on a map, targets, sorties, kill ratios. But on that wet morning near the border, it had been something else entirely, a close-quarters scramble between machines never meant to meet, fought by men with no time to be anything but terrified and competent. And the jungle, indifferent as ever, absorbed the wreckage and the blood and the story and went on growing. In Vietnam, the aftermath of a day like that didn't arrive in a single wave. It came in small, delayed fragments. A week after Granite, Ragman Two-Four's damaged Huey was slung under a Chinook and hauled back to a maintenance area where mechanics stared at the tail boom holes and whistled low. They replaced the tail rotor gearbox, patched the skin, swapped out hydraulic lines, and wrote their own quiet commentary in grease pencil on the inside of access panels. Small jokes that sounded like prayer when your hands were close to the machinery that kept you alive. Keenan's M60 was taken for inspection. Armorers checked headspace and timing, examined the barrel, noted heat discoloration, replaced worn parts. They returned it to him with the same indifference they gave every weapon. The gun did not carry history. The man did. A month later, a formal ceremony was staged at a larger base farther east, where the ground was flatter and the audience could be arranged. Brass attended in clean uniforms. A chaplain spoke words about courage and duty. Rourke stood rigid, eyes forward, feeling absurd in a moment that tried to make a clean shape out of something that had been chaos. Keenan stood beside him, younger looking than he had any right to after what he'd lived through, jaw clenched as if he were holding back a confession. They were awarded for extraordinary heroism in aerial flight, the language polished until it shone. Rourke received the Distinguished Flying Cross with a V device. Keenan received the Silver Star, an award that made some men whisper because it was rare for an enlisted door gunner. The citation described engaging hostile jet aircraft with a door-mounted machine gun, contributing to the defense of a friendly fire support base. It did not say 3 MiGs. It did not need to. Everyone in that formation knew what the paper was trying not to claim. The controversy did not fade, though. Fighter pilots in other units dismissed it in bars, not out of malice, but out of professional instinct. In their world, kills were clean, recorded by gun cameras and radar tapes. A door gunner's claim threatened the architecture of their expertise. Some insisted the MiGs must have been damaged by ground fire, or that the jets had been hit by their own shrapnel from near misses. Others argued the pilots may have made fatal errors in the low-level attack and crashed in the turn, with helicopter fire merely coincidental. What the paperwork could not capture was the cost in nerves. Keenan remained in country through the end of his tour. He flew again, because refusing would have required a different kind of courage. He continued to put his hands on the spade grips every time the Huey lifted, continued to watch tree lines, continued to fire at muzzle flashes that appeared like bright thoughts in the green. But his sleep changed. He began to wake at random hours, heart hammering, convinced he could hear the tearing sound of cannon fire in the rain. He started writing his letters more carefully, as if the right sentence might keep his family from imagining the wrong thing. Rourke kept flying too, logging hours that piled up like debts. After Granite, he was assigned a brief stint as an instructor, rotating new pilots through the dangerous basics. How to read weather that lied, how to land in dust, how to keep the aircraft moving when the ground wanted it stopped. He didn't tell the story of the MiGs often, and when he did, he told it without drama. They came low, he'd say. We shot back. It was his way of denying the event the power to own him. In late 1969, the 158th moved its area of operations. The war shifted, as it always did, like a bruise spreading. The enemy adapted. More coordinated sappers at night, more 12.7 and 14.5 millimeter guns hidden near landing zones, more discipline in ambushes. The helicopters kept flying because that was what made the war move. Keenan rotated home in early 1970. At the airport, he carried a duffel bag that felt lighter than it should have because it didn't contain what he'd left behind. His family met him with smiles that hurt. In the months that followed, he tried to work at a factory, then a warehouse, then a trucking company. He married, had a son, divorced, remarried. The Silver Star sat in a drawer because medals were heavy objects to keep in a room where you wanted to breathe. He never joined a motorcycle club or became a public speaker. He was not interested in being a symbol. He was interested in being a man who could sleep. Rourke stayed in the Army aviation community longer. He re-upped, flew stateside, then served as an advisor on helicopter tactics during the later phases of the war. He watched younger pilots learn the same lessons he'd learned, and he watched politics shift, and he watched the country's attention fracture. When Saigon fell in 1975, he was not surprised, but the news still felt like something being closed and locked without asking the men inside. He retired as a chief warrant officer with a quiet record and a habit of scanning skies, even on clear days. The story of Granite did not become famous in the way some stories did. It did not fit cleanly into the existing mythology of Vietnam. It was too strange, too specific, too likely to be dismissed as exaggeration by anyone who hadn't felt rotor wash and monsoon rain at the same time. For years, it lived mostly in unit reunions and whispered conversations, in the kind of memory that survives because the people who carry it refuse to let it be erased. On the other side of the border, there were also lives altered by that morning. The names of the MiG pilots were not known to the Americans at Granite. They would remain unknown because wars rarely give you the courtesy of knowing who you killed. But later, fragments emerged from defectors and captured documents, references to an engagement near the fence line, to pilots ordered to conduct low-level interdiction against artillery positions, believed to be supporting incursions. Those pilots had been trained for a war of altitude and speed. They had been sent into a valley where rain cut visibility and terrain compressed choices until pride could become fatal. In any other sky, they might have lived. In that sky, they ran into a Huey crew that refused to die quietly. When the war ended, the United States tried to make a narrative out of it. Numbers were counted, maps were redrawn. Veterans came home with the jungle still under their skin. The event at Granite remained a footnote, sometimes 2 confirmed MiGs, sometimes 3, sometimes only a myth, depending on who told it and what they needed the war to be. Years later, a historian digging through tapes found the radio recording from that morning. In the static and overlapping voices, you could hear the moment the first MiG went in, the stunned silence, the disbelief in a gunship pilot's voice. It was not proof in a scientific sense, but it was proof in a human one. Men had watched something happen and had been changed by it. Keenan attended one reunion in the 1990s. He sat at the edge of the room, listening to men talk about places with names that still tasted like rust. Someone raised a glass to 3 MiG. The room went quiet, respectful. Keenan didn't smile. He looked down at his hands and said softly, "I just didn't want them to kill us." Then he excused himself and went outside where the air was dry and safe and nothing moved in the trees. Rourke died in 2008, quietly, after a long illness. At his funeral, a former crew chief spoke about him not as a hero, but as a pilot who always remembered to check on his people. "He flew like he was responsible," the man said. It was the highest compliment an aviator could receive. Keenan lived longer. In his later years, when his son asked him about the medal, he finally told the story, but he told it without the number 3. He told it as a story about a valley, about rain, about a helicopter spinning, about a decision made with no good options. He did not tell it as a story about killing. He told it as a story about refusing to be helpless. Because that was what that morning truly was, beneath the improbable mechanics and the skeptical paperwork. A small act of defiance inside a war that often made men feel like objects being moved by forces they could not see. The Vietnam War is often remembered in categories that make it easier to hold. There was the ground war, mud, jungle, ambush doctrine, helicopters dropping men into clearings that weren't clearings at all. There was the air war, jets and radar, missile envelopes, call signs spoken with cool precision. There was the political war, fought in rooms far from the smell of wet earth. Those categories comfort the mind because they suggest order. But Vietnam did not respect categories. On March 14, 1969, over a valley near the border where maps turned vague and the jungle grew dense enough to hide entire companies, those categories collided. A MiG-17, built to fight in the thin, cold air at altitude, dropped into a wet bowl of terrain where speed became a liability and every turn was a constraint. A Huey, built to lift troops and supplies and bloodied men out of trouble, found itself in a fight it was never designed to win. And in that collision, the outcome hinged not on technology or doctrine, but on a handful of human decisions made faster than fear could fully form. What made the event endure was not the number of jets claimed, though that number carried its own gravitational pull. It was the way the moment revealed a truth about the war. Survival often belonged to the people who could accept the impossible and act anyway. Keenan's trick shot, as some later called it, was not a circus stunt. It was not a clean cinematic act. It was a desperate calculation made in a cabin that smelled of fuel and fear, with wind tearing at a man's helmet and the ground rushing up through rotating air. The M60 was not a magic weapon. It was a crude, reliable machine that threw small pieces of metal into space and hoped the world arranged itself so that metal met something vital. For it to meet the vital parts of a jet required a chain of conditions, altitude, distance, angle, timing, that had no right to align. There is also the question of technology and how it lies to us in retrospect. The Vietnam War unfolded at the hinge between eras. Helicopters were still treated by some commanders as taxis with rotors, not as a new dimension of maneuver. Jets were still flown by men who relied on their eyes and instincts, even as radar and missiles promised a future where the pilot would become a technician. On paper, a MiG-17's advantage over a UH-1H was absolute. Speed, climb rate, heavy cannons, the ability to choose when to engage and when to leave. But combat does not live on paper. Combat lives in envelopes: altitude, speed, turn radius, visibility, terrain, and those envelopes can collapse. The MiGs at Granite had entered an envelope where their advantages thinned. Low-level passes forced them to trade speed for aim. The cloud base and rain reduced their standoff time. The valley walls constrained their turns. Every correction cost energy, and every cost brought them closer to a stall they could not afford, near the ground. Meanwhile, the helicopter, slow, vulnerable, and stubbornly present, could keep turning inside a space that a jet could only visit briefly before it ran out of room. The M60 itself was a humble instrument, but it had its own brutal honesty. It fired a 7.62 51mm round with enough velocity to punch through thin aluminum skin at close range. It was air-cooled, meaning sustained bursts risked overheating. But in those seconds of crisis, overheating was tomorrow's problem. Its feed system, if kept clean and properly timed, would keep throwing rounds until the belt ran out or the gunner's finger failed. Against a jet, the odds were terrible, but the geometry of close range could make terrible odds temporarily negotiable. That is why those who were there remembered not the explosion, but the twitch, the sudden yaw, the moment the MiG stopped flying like a decision and started flying like a mistake. In combat, the transition from control to loss is often small. It can look like a shrug, it can look like a hesitation, then it becomes final. And it is why the debate over confirmation never truly mattered to the men on the ground. They knew what the jets had done to the base in seconds. They knew how close the cannon rounds had come to detonating ammunition or cutting down medics and gunners. Whether the third MiG crashed exactly where the patrol could photograph it, or whether it limped away and went down farther north, the fact remained: the attack stopped. The base survived. A handful of infantrymen lived to see the afternoon because someone in a spinning helicopter chose to fire back instead of waiting to die. That is the cruel intimacy of Vietnam. It was a war of proximity. Helicopters brought men close. Ambushes required closeness. Even air power, when forced into the valleys, became intimate, reduced from distant roar to visible canopy and rivet lines. The war's most defining moments often happened at distances where you could see another human being's posture, where you could almost imagine their last thought. If there is a legacy worth holding from Granite, it is not the headline of a machine gun defeating a fighter. It is the reminder that courage in that war often looked like ordinary competence under extraordinary pressure. It looked like a pilot keeping the rotor turning even as the tail tried to spin him into the ground. It looked like a gunner's hands staying steady when the wind and fear wanted them to shake. It looked like people deciding, in the half-second they were given, to act. When people ask what Vietnam was like, they often want a single image that can stand for the whole thing. A helicopter against a sunset, a soldier in a rice paddy, a jet streaking overhead. The truth is that Vietnam was all of those at once, overlapping, confusing, refusing to separate neatly. It was the whine of a turbine and the crack of a rifle in the same breath. It was rain on hot metal. It was fear made ordinary. In that sense, the story of a door gunner firing at a MiG is not an outlier. It is a concentrated version of the war's deepest character, a place where the improbable became routine, where the boundary between survival and death was thin enough to cut you just by looking at it, and where men carried the weight of those thin boundaries long after the jungle faded behind them. If you're watching this far from that valley, take a moment to consider what it means that wars are remembered by the stories that slip through the cracks of official history. If someone in your family served in Vietnam, on the ground, in the air, or on the rivers, share their name or their unit in the comments if you're comfortable doing so. And if you want more of these hard, human corners of the war brought into the light, subscribe and stay with us for the next story.